Welcome to the What the Tech podcast, where we unpack the ever-evolving world of technology and how it impacts our lives and our businesses. I'm your host, Troy Vermillion, and today we're going to be diving headfirst into the critical yet often misunderstood realm of procurement. So grab your headphones, turn up your volume, and let's get ready to revolutionize the way you think about sourcing and supply chain. As the legendary Steve Jobs said, innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Remembering that in the world of procurement, being a follower just might leave you trailing in the dust. Now let's talk about procurement for a moment. It's not just about penny pinching and paper pushing. No, my friends, it's actually an art. It's really a science, and well, it's sometimes like trying to herd cats while juggling flaming torches. But fear not, we're here to guide you through the do's and don'ts in the ins and outs and the ups and downs of getting what you need without getting stuck in the mud, right? So put your listening ears on. Being stuck in your ways about procurement has been a downfall for so many in the world of business, and it's really time to learn and innovate and adapt, because in the world of business, it's about adapt or die. And we're here to help you thrive, not just survive. Let's go. Today, I'm thrilled to have back my co-host, the one and only Stephen Faust, a highly credentialed technologist, sales professional, and enthusiast. Stephen's wit and wisdom have made him a fan favorite. His unique humor, combined with his insightful perspectives, always makes for a lively discussion. So buckle up for an exciting conversation as Stephen and I dissect the future of software, sales, procurement. Really exciting. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Yeah. It may not on its surface look that appealing, but I think it's very important, and also it's like a lot of aspects of business that can be taken for granted, or its role can really be minimalized, to an extent where companies just don't understand all the value that lies there, because it's very easy to treat everything you buy like a commodity, like you're buying plumbing. That's a term I hear a lot. You can't treat our product like plumbing, and what they mean by that is you can't assume that I have to have plumbing because my building has to have water, but all plumbing's basically the same, and my goal is to buy it once and then to run it into the ground, because why would I replace a pipe if it's working, right? Like, that's how they view a lot of sections of their business, and that's where you're giving up a ton of value, right? And I think that's hopefully something we can expose in this chat today.
Well, you and I haven't spent much time in plumbing, but I love the beautiful picture that you laid out for plumbing there, because we all use it. Like, don't take plumbing for granted, right? Because if it was not working, like, think about the alternative to that, right?
Yeah, the implications. Yeah. Right. But I think also too that most people they think, if I upgraded my plumbing today, how much would it cost? Probably a ton of money to replace all your pipes, right? And they would see no real return on investment. Like, why would I do that, right? Unless they're just completely, like, that's how they think about it. Like, if they're falling apart and there's leaks, and then I need to. But that's how you start viewing your IT assets the same way. Well, they're not on fire. Like, no one's died walking next to the server. Why do I need to upgrade it, right? Like, you can't think of them in the same, context, right?
No, 100%. Plumbing is probably one of the worst, trades for me, because, I'm pretty good at most things, and I'm totally getting off track here, but I'm pretty good at most things. I can put up sheetrock, I can paint, I can, I could build something, but when it comes to plumbing, something is always leaking, man. So I feel like maybe there is a correlation between that and procurement. Like, there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things. The wrong thing to do would be for Steve to hire Troy to do his plumbing. First of all, I hate it. And second of all, something's going to be leaking when I leave your house, Steve.
Yeah, no doubt. It's going to be covered. I, in my business, would try to hook up coffee makers, and you think that would be simple. Extremely hard. I literally had plumbers turning me down, and I was having to go to specialty plumbing supply stores. And at the end of it, it was like those things you buy for the kids in summer. It was just ridiculous. And the only way I legitimately solved it by buying this waterproof epoxy putty from the hardware store, I bought a ton of them, and I just created this giant ball of them. All the entire Frankenstein of plumbing I got to make that work, I cocooned it. It looked like something from another planet. And then, as long as you couldn't see it, like it was on the backside. And that's how they got their coffee. That place ran. I'm not going to say the name of the business. They ran with that, my coffee, whatever you want to call that, shenanigans for 2 years. And I remember when we sold the business and they were coming to replace it, the technician was like, I've never seen this. And I'm like, 2 years, buddy. It ran for 2 years. No leaks.
Oh, geez. Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't know that I could go to that extreme, Steve. I'd probably figure it out before then, but I love the fact that you were committed to the cause no matter what. No matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was like, it's going to work. I don't care. Yeah.
All right. So, Steve, you were telling me a story, and we just got to share it with people about this time that you crashed. Well, you actually had somebody, you made them laugh so hard that you had them crash into a bush one time. I think it was at a drive-thru. Is that right? You got to tell us this because it is hilarious.
Yeah. Well, first off, I was reminding you that a lot of my humor, I think, is literally just random thoughts that go through my head that I decide to verbalize. And this one was no different. I didn't, this is a typical day for me in college. Typical day for me probably now as well, just going through a drive-thru. But in this particular instance, my cousin was driving. His fiance was in the passenger seat. I was in the back seat. And we were going to Burger King, Jack in the Box, if I can get my story straight, somewhere off Riverside. And we were waiting for our food, and they had in the little glass window, right as you kind of pull up, it had a sign that you could go and call this number or go to the website for to become a Big Brother. And I just randomly said, hey, I wonder if you're a midget, if you could be a Big Brother. I remember my cousin he had the wheel and he just swerved off to the side because he was bending over laughing. And I said it was like one of those contagious things because his fiance also kind of had this like sound to her laughter. So she's going, and I totally remember the guy holding the food just feel like, what is happening? Because the car had drifted into the bush and this other noise is coming from the car. And then my cousin didn't ever say anything to him. He just took the food and drove away. And there's still like this big gash where he had hit the thing. And I felt it was a valid question, I feel like if you're, some poor kid doesn't have a role model, and they're like, don't worry, Billy, we got you a Big Brother here. And then it's like, someone that, let's say, doesn't live up to expectations, right? I don't want to offend anybody that's in that category. So, I'll just say smaller than average person. But, I just felt like that would be, it would be an interesting, I wonder if they'd subtly eliminate him from the candidacy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how many midgets are actually watching this show, but I do feel like there's something that, like, if you can't laugh at yourself, for whatever reason, it doesn't have to be some obscure thing like I'm, shorter than everybody else, but like whatever it is, like there are definitely things about myself, and I'm not going to disclose any of them, but Steve knows some things about myself that I'm like, I'm probably not the proudest of that, but at the end of the day, it is me, right? It is what it is, and you get what you get. But that's a hilarious story. I could see myself like totally driving up the curb, like belly laughing at that. Yeah. And my wife, like your cousin's wife, right? She would be honking, like, she's got a deviated septum, so she'd be like, so it would sound like we had a flock of geese in the back, with me kind of giggling. I actually giggle like a girl. I'm not proud of it, but I do it, right? That's one thing I'm not proud of. But when you get me laughing, like, I start to cry, and I start to giggle like a 10-year-old girl. It's really true.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's great.
Good times, Steve. And I will tell you, Steve, situationally, is one of the funniest people I've ever met. Like, he will tell you stories about things all day, every day, with his obscure, like, perspective. And so I just love spending time with you, Steve. I mean, like, look, you tell stories better than anybody I've ever met. But anyways, we're supposed to be talking about procurement, right? Like buying stuff, right? And buying stuff in a way that makes sense for both parties, right? So let's just start off with maybe some common mistakes that you see, Steve, and I can kind of add some commentary to it. But I think there's a lot of mistakes that people make across the procurement process on both sides, right? And so let's talk specifically from the buying side, right? Like what do you typically see from buyers when they're potentially looking at purchasing something? It could be around RFPs, it could be around kind of just the wasteful processes that they have. Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's like anything else in business. You need to come into it prepared. You need to have a strategy. You need to be able to execute to get that strategy. And then it needs to be a very clear understanding of things like who is involved in the sales cycle, like who are the decision makers, what is our timeline, and kind of what is the budget. And I think at the end of the day, procurement, you could name even more, but those are some of the big heavy hitters. But you've got to look at it in terms of just because, let's say, some methodology worked when you were buying thing A or for business B or whatever, doesn't always mean it can apply again. That's another common mistake, is I bought this thing this way and there wasn't an issue, everything worked great. Now I'm going to apply it in this other area. That's a very common mistake. I mean, I think I made the extreme example of someone that buys office supplies is now in charge of buying a $5 million collaboration platform. But I've seen it. I've seen it where people don't take into account how many moving parts there are. They also don't get a good appreciation for how many decision makers are involved, which you'd think would be very easy to understand. But so many people that work in procurement don't have a good grasp of, okay, is this going to have to go before the board? When does the board meet? Does the board normally decide on the first time we present it to them? What all is the board going to want? I mean, I've had so many conversations where we start down a path, we find out that no, we needed to have involved these other people, or no, this thing that we thought didn't need to go before the board does need to go before the board because they changed. So before it used to be any purchase over $1 million, now it's any purchase over 500,000. So again, these fundamentals, I call the blocking and tackling of procurement, you definitely have to have them dialed in. And I think it's a responsibility of both the buyer and the seller to try to come up with things early on about, okay, what is a good understanding of just when you're trying to implement? Because again, a lot of times I'm amazed at how far down we'll get in a sales path, and they'll say, well, we need this in by 2 weeks from now. And then you're like, it's totally impossible. Like we can't, there's no way to deliver that. And what's really sad is I've seen ones where we spend 3 months doing pre-sales to find out they need it in 2 weeks. Like if we had known day one that, look, we have to get off vendor A by February 1st. If we knew that day one, we could have done something. We could have like lined up the resources and told you, look, this is going to be, because another big common mistake is thinking, okay, I've implemented a contact center before. I know it takes whatever, 3 weeks. Well, that's not every vendor, right? And then even if it could be done in 3 weeks, that doesn't mean we don't have people ahead of you in the queue, right? Again, speaking as if I was an actual contact center vendor, but all those things are misconceptions, because just because you've done it once before with another vendor doesn't mean every vendor is going to operate that way. So that's a big part of it, is really laying out clear expectations. And don't be afraid to be transparent. I think that's another problem is too many people on both sides are hiding cards, and they think they're being strategic. But at the end of the day, the deal's going to blow up because you were being a little too strategic. I think it's okay to say, look, we're in the early stages of the procurement element. My job is just to kind of gather some information. We're not looking to close anything in the next 12 months. I think that'll set the tone. Now, don't get me wrong. Salespeople are going to try to close you no matter what you say. But what you don't want to do is set an expectation like, look, I'm looking to close in the next 30 days. And then they're going to do everything they can to get you to whatever, and then you're not being honest with them, right? Because again, then you're like, oh wait, you said that, and again, it just sets a really bad tone for everybody involved in the sales process. And I think those are some big mistakes. I also think it's very much an element in this industry, and I'm not going to say every industry, where customers feel like it's okay to abuse vendors. Like, we'll make the vendor jump through a million hoops, answer these questions, or partner, reseller, whoever. And then at the end of the day, if we just decide to do nothing, who cares? They'll jump through the hoops again because we've got a big name behind us. But I think over time, that definitely is going to work to your detriment. I know some big customers that we've basically blacklisted. A few of my firms have blacklisted, which I applaud. Nothing to me reeks of desperation more than a company that will just continually let a customer abuse them. Either that's in pre-sales, post-sales, implementation. I just think at some point your business has to stand firm for what you're going to accept. And if your business is basically like, we don't care that they're not going to agree, they're not going to live by the terms that we signed in the contract, right? Then again, you're going to set that precedent, right? I don't care how big a name they are. You just, letting people walk over you is not a good business strategy. And the sad thing is that I see that more and more. The more the price tag on what they're going to close, the more they let them walk over you. And I feel like what that really also does is destroys the morale of your base that's supporting it, right? Because you try to set standards, you try to play by the rules, whatever that is, but then you see the customer basically just blatantly running roughshod over everything, right? Like not showing up for meetings, saying things that never happened, claiming you were going to do something when you didn't do something, saying that you said it was going to be ready in a week, and you're like, we never said that. And then you're just like, well, just do it. If you start off, to me, especially if it's a net new logo, that is setting the tone for that relationship, right? And if they know they can beat you up and treat you poorly, it's not like they're gonna switch the moment you close that business and then become a nice customer, right? They're gonna just exploit you the whole time. Why wouldn't they? You've given them that. So I think that, when you're in procurement, you definitely don't be shy to ask for what you want. But at the same time, I think you don't ever want to fall into the category where, these companies don't even want to do business with you because you're getting a reputation. I've seen it. And I think they also take that for granted. A lot of companies feel like, look, we're a big name. We can treat anybody like anything. And people are going to fall over themselves to respond to our RFP. And I think those days are definitely, behind us.
Well, I think you provide some pretty great examples that we can springboard off of. One of the ones that I think is most important is that, again, setting expectations is probably most important at the very beginning, whether it's timeline or things like that. Because how often do you run into a situation where you're presenting $1 million solution and they have a $200,000 budget, right? So expectations weren't set. And a lot of times people, I hear the question budget all the time. Like, what is your budget, right? And the truth is they oftentimes don't know what their budget is, right? And so sometimes we have to start with the problem. How big is the problem, right? Because if you don't solve the problem, your budget might, whatever you budget you've allotted for, it may not solve the problem, right? And so that's an important component is connecting those two dots. But outside of that, I think is the interactions, right? If you're just looking at somebody as a vendor, right, and not a true strategic partnership, then especially when you're talking software or some of these more complex type systems, you're very quickly going to get, I think, into a combative relationship. Like you were talking, like, hey, my expectations are higher than you promised, higher than you can deliver, right? And I probably negotiated a pretty low price if I'm that person as well, right? Or a very competitive price. And so now it's a lopsided, right? Like, how long is this actually going to work? Am I always going to be disappointed because my expectations aren't in line with the solution that I purchased because my budget wasn't high enough to purchase the solution I actually needed, right? And how often do we see that? I see it all the time, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, what are some ways that, somebody in procurement can maybe approach the process in a less kind of, combative way to give you what you need to effectively build a proposal that actually works for me financially and fundamentally from a deliverable standpoint.
Well, I think part of it is someone that's not involved in the process, unfortunately, a lot of times let's say there is a budget, we'll set it. They'll say, okay, you've got $100,000 to spend on this thing. And where do they get that number? A lot of times it's thin air. they'll just pull it out of a hat, or just say, you know what, my budget's 100,000 because I feel like it's 100,000, right? Like, you know, when you try to get down to it, where did this number come from? And who knows? Like, maybe this person bought something 10 years ago and it was $100,000. You don't know, right? But I think fairly early on is to understand, okay, who are the decision makers, and try to get them involved, and then understanding, you know, kind of where the market's at, understanding the process, and then say, look, you can, you know, go shop around, and most of the time, you know, you could maybe, most vendors honestly are going to be, you can find someone lower or higher, you know, just again, keep it in the frame of cost. And that's a common thing, is like, let's say you get 5 people that respond to a bid, and they'll throw out the highest and they'll throw out the lowest. Again, that's a very cheap way to do procurement, right? Because you never know what's going on there. And I think you've got to step back from it. Again, stop just looking at it like a commodity, like the plumbing, right? And start attaching things like, what does value look like to me? Like, you know, value selling, I think, is a reality, because that's really what needs to be observed. Is most companies, especially the more expensive the product, there's a lot more going on than you see. Like, how is this going to improve things like my retention rate? How is this going to improve things like how I do business with other vendors, right? And then that's going to have this trickle effect, right? And if a system's easy to use and people aren't quitting because they're frustrated with it, or the fact that they're having to use 17 tools, that has a value, right? That you can't look at one without the other. That's to me, that's kind of like the lazy man's procurement, is thinking, okay, I have to have a way for people to answer the phones. So I know I need this thing, but I'm going to do whatever I can to get it to nothing. Well, you're leaving so much on the table. And the fact that what you see in IT is that customers, a ton of times, and even beyond just IT, but IT especially, is they're very much like, look, we have a small budget and we have a singular problem, and we're going to find a vendor to solve that problem for as cheap as possible. And then we'll have another problem, and we'll find a vendor and they'll solve that problem, right? Let's say we need now a way to communicate with our customers over SMS. Okay, we found an SMS vendor. Okay, let's say we found a way that we have to communicate to this BPO. All right, we buy a vendor for that. We buy a vendor for, and then at the end of the day, you know, it's this terrible nightmare that they've created, this tapestry of Frankenstein proportion, and they don't know how they got there. And they don't understand that now I have to run 17 different reports from 17 different systems. And oh, by the way, the licensing are expiring randomly at different intervals, right? Because I bought them at different times. And some of them it's a 3-year contract, some of it's a 5-year contract. Some of them it's paid per use, some of it's a fixed life. Some of them, and you know, you take a full-time staff just to keep track of all this craziness that you've created, right? And then when you go and talk to them and say, hey, look, you know, I can solve the Frankenstein, the way their procurement is set up is they don't even have control. Well, marketing bought the SMS thing, and this other department bought the da-da-da thing, and this thing is owned by da-da-da-da-da, and I'm only in charge of procurement for this one piece. And it's like, that's again where you've got to rise above. You've got to look at it. Somebody needs to champion that thing. That's what I like to call it, is someone's got to take a step back and say, look, we've made a bunch of very unstrategic decisions with low budgets on all these different departments. And what is it translated to? Bad customer experience, bad internal experience. And now it's a massive thing to maintain, to administer, and everything else. We've done this to ourselves. And that, I think, is another thing they've got to take ownership of. And I feel like that's, again, where you have to have a strategy driving your procurement. That, let's say my goal, starting now, is for us to get to a simplified system, less tools, etc. That is a strategy that then procurement can go execute on. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of times no one is being that strategic voice. And then the vendors are trying to help you. They're trying to speak that back to you and say, look, man, especially, you know, in the role of a reseller, you're like, look, I'm not telling you it has to be vendor X, but you cannot keep going down this path of, you know, band-aiding problems with random vendors who, again, a lot of times, guess who's the cheapest? It's the smaller, fly-by-night IT firms that are overseas that you're never going to get a hold of the salespeople, the support people, and they get absorbed or acquired or go out of business, and then you're just flying around trying to solve more of these, you know, band-aids. I think it all starts with you've got to take a holistic approach. You've got to look at what is the overall goal of my IT procurement, right? Is it just to Band-Aid all these problems? And is it just to go into every IT procurement as if, I'm going for something that's just going to get me by? Like, that's my goal. Again, thinking with the plumbing mentality. I'm not interested in ROIs. I'm not interested in, the other stuff. And again, there was a time where certain IT elements were a commodity. Like, you had a phone, and guess what you could do with that phone? You could pick it up and you could dial a number. That was it. Like, and then amazingly at one point you could go like this and pick up another call. Like, when you could, that was a big innovation, right? But that's the problem, is that, you kind of started treating these things like commodities when they were commodities. The moment they stopped being commodities, they started adding a ton of value. And that's another thing I think is insane to me, is to get to the end of a procurement process and then say, okay, nobody wants to pay for this thing because it's too expensive. I need you to give me an ROI, like a really deep, in-depth ROI. But then you give them nothing to work with, right? You're like, well, I don't know the ROI. I don't know how much you're paying your people. I don't know even all the different roles they have within your organization. I don't know all these different things. So, that's, again, we're speaking back to the relationship. You need to let that partner, vendor, or whatever, you need to let them in. You need to let them help you understand what's going on, like in terms of just in general, like, how is this value getting specifically applied to my business? Because the value is there, but it is unique to your business. And I think anybody that can tell you an ROI without learning anything about your business is totally full of it, right? And again, when you go talk to whoever, is the executive team to get the sponsorship, to get the buy-in, maybe above the budget that they wanted, how are you going to pull that off? Because they're going to want justification. Like, I thought this thing was going to be 100,000. Now you're telling me it's $1 million. Where are we getting this other 900,000? And if you say, look, it's a self-funded roadmap, the next thing they're going to say is, how do you know that? And then that's where, it's if you have the relationship, you've got the references. You said, look, they've worked in the financial sector before. They've worked with banks of our size. They have taken this info from us. They've told us this is going to be the plan, how we're going to roll it out, how it's going to eliminate these 5 systems down to 1, how it's going to, even if it has a 2% impact over here and a 1% impact over here, that's going to translate to this much saving. I mean, that is how you build it from both ends, is really just not, sticking in and being like, no, 100,000 no matter what. Like, again, like that's where you're getting too focused on that number, and you're not looking at the vision that you're trying to pull off. And unfortunately, if you think about it, it is way easier to solve onesie twosie strategic problems than it is to solve for an IT strategy for the next 5 years.
Right.
One is way easier, right? Like, I need text to speech today. Who can give me that? And you go to Google and it comes back with 4 million vendors, and you pick the one that looks the cheapest, right? Or the one that, another one we wrote down on our list ahead of time is what I call vendor bigotry. Like, I work with vendor X at my old company, and then the company before that, and I like vendor X because I know everyone at vendor X. And again, vendor X might be a great vendor, but if you somehow think they're the solution every time for every problem, like, you're kidding yourself, right? And you're not, honestly taking the big picture. And one of the things I've advocated for a while is just simple things that I think of almost like, I feel like they've gone down in terms of attendance, but it's just like simple things like trade shows where you're able to experience, a lot of what those vendors have to offer in a relatively short period of time. I mean, because again, let's talk it through. In a normal procurement cycle, maybe a vendor does 2 to 3 demos for you, and those take time to schedule, they take time to set up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they might be a little more customized, but if you have 2 to 3 demos per vendor, and then you have 5 vendors you're evaluating, that's 15 meetings, right? And those are hour and time, and then, it's very involved. Versus you go to a trade show for a day, and you kill it, right? And you get to ask all kinds of questions. You notice which ones are promoting which feature over whatever feature, and then you kind of winnow it down right there. Right? Because guess what else you're figuring out? Oh, who's easy to work with, right? Who do I feel like was more personable? Like, in terms of, like, they were really more interested in learning about my business versus just shoving content down my throat, right? I mean, just simple things like that. Honestly, that's a big part of it as well, is you cannot be so rigid to not look at those, what I call intangibles, right? Like, okay, this vendor checked these boxes. This vendor checked these boxes. What do the people like to work with, right? Like, do they do what they say they're going to do on time, right? And I think that's all those things I feel like go into the procurement cycle. And that's why I feel like that's a great way to kind of balance out the entire approach that you take to it.
Yeah, I think there's some components in there that really hit home with me. One of which was when you were talking about this kind of Frankenstein type thing that people create over time that is just so difficult to manage, but it's also difficult to unclip from, because now you have all these systems, they all have different contract end dates and things like that. And so, a vendor coming in and actually giving you some sort of timeline and strategy for, pulling all of those things together. And not only is it going to be more expensive, but, typically the ROI is going to be much better because now you don't have all these independent systems, that aren't working in cohesion together. I also think it's really important for us, when you're talking about cost, right? Cost is one thing, but value is something very different, right? And one of the biggest misconceptions around procurement specifically is getting a low price.
Because that's how they try to justify their existence. Hey, without me, the procurement master, you would have paid $20,000 more for this system. So I saved the company $20,000. But at the end of the day, if the other system provided more value and was more expensive, but you realized the better ROI, you didn't do your business a service, right? Again, not saying that certain industries that won't be the case, like, you saved $20,000 on a fencing system and all you wanted was a fence to keep out whatever, then yes, he's the man, right? But when you're dealing with things that are more sophisticated than a fence or the plumbing, right, you cannot take that approach. That's going to burn you, right? And if you look at companies that have gone out of their way to really be champions of IT, it's incredible how you see customers just flocking to this firm because guess what? They're very innovative. And they, trust me, there's a reason they call it the bleeding edge. Don't get me wrong. They probably had some growing pains, but they're doing things that no one else is doing and they're reaping the benefits. If you were one of the first banks to do deposit check by, taking a picture on your cell phone, you better believe that spread like wildfire because anybody that was having to drive to a stinking bank to deposit a check, right, was instantly like, what bank is that? Right? Like that's how disruptive this technology and beneficial. You can reap the benefits, right? Just look at it, anything like industry, like grocery stores. The first grocery store that's decided to start using barcodes, right? Like huge. Yeah. Imagine. And I guarantee you, if that procurement guy's like, well, how much is that barcode scanner? Forget that noise, right? Like, we're going to whatever, paper and pencil, or it's just like, no, stop it, right? Because you're not looking at the big picture. You're not looking at the value this is going to start bringing. And you're also not looking at what your competition is doing. I remember talking to companies, this is 10 years ago, it tells you anything, and I said, are you tracking social media for anything, for support, for leads, for whatever? And they said, no, we have a social media channel, but we post, I don't know, like something about the business, but we don't really use it for any other purpose. And I remember going, well, I think that, that's the strategic mistake. And they were kind of laughing it off. And I said, look, I just sent out this random text. And this one I want to say was about, it's your industry. It was about healthcare benefits. And I said, I just posted it to the world to, now what is now X, formerly Facebook. And I just said, hey, I'm in charge of human resources. And I've just been so fed up with our current vendor that I'm looking around for the next, investment our firm needs to make in human resource software. And I just threw it out there to the world. And I put that responses I got on a giant PowerPoint, a giant screen in front of them. I'm like, these are your 4 competitors. Every single one of them responded to me within 24 hours. You did nothing. And I said, you don't think you're leaving money on the table there? And then they were just like, everyone was doing one of those, like looking around because they finally tuned into, that's fine. You can keep your head in the sand all you want.
Right.
And you're saving money. Like, why do we need an extra doohickey in the background? Looks like a waste of time to me. And then all of a sudden I show you how your competitors are all over it. Then you're like, we need that. It's almost like someone in fast food being like, they've got a drive-through. A what through? Right? Like, again, you got to find ways to innovate and really, capitalize on that. And unfortunately, too many vendors are like, we're used to doing things a certain way. We're used to buying a certain types of things. And the moment it's some type of disruptive technology, it's like well, we don't have budget for that. We don't know where we're going to get the money. We've never bought a blah, blah, blah before. Oh, we don't even know if we need one of those. And then you're just like, yes, clearly it's going to have value. And then it's like the machine is so, like, you can't pull apart the gears, right, to fit in this strategy.
Well, so clearly, the procurement process I've seen for many companies needs some refresh work. And so my thought here kind of leads me to the whole RFP process, right? How many times have you received an RFP? I know countless number of times for me. Everybody hates these, by the way. Like, the vendors hate them. I'm pretty sure the procurement team hates them. And if you don't, you're a Satanist, and nobody likes you, to be honest, right? Also, does anybody actually read all of the questions and answers? Well, yeah, the person responding has to, right? But does anybody on the procurement side actually read all of those? Because you're receiving a 50-page document from, say, 5 or 10 vendors. It's ridiculous. Like, is somebody actually reading that? Like, that's my real question. Mm-hmm. Hey, if you're in procurement, be honest. Is anybody actually reading that? Comment below. Seriously. Like, I'm interested. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's like going to the dentist, doing these sorts of things, right? Like, nobody actually enjoys it. But it's necessary, right, for you to make sure that you're getting the right solutions. But is it really the most effective structure for actually doing that? And I would argue that it probably isn't. It's kind of an antiquated process because it's not really as two-way as it typically is. Let me tell you what has happened many times when I've done an RFP, me personally. The vendor says this. They say, Troy, you've brought some very interesting things to light. I think we'd like to do business with you. But the problem is I have to go through an RFP process. Look, as long as you don't suck in that RFP process, you do a good job, you're going to get the business. That's what's happened every time I've won the RFP, right? Is like there's a clear kind of front runner, and there's a bunch of people that submit useless RFPs. Now, I'm not saying you can't win business off RFPs, because you can show up and wow people. Like, I know that happens. And a lot of times RFPs that are submitted, nobody even knows. There's not like anybody in process yet. But every time I've done it, I'm not willing to do it if I don't know I've got at least a 50-50 shot to get that business. I'm just not willing to do it because it's a lot of extra work for no reason, especially if you don't have a department that does RFPs. And I've had both, where I've had to do the RFP and I have a department, all they do is RFPs. And so what are your thoughts around that? Because I feel like everybody feels this process is painful.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things going on with the RFPs. And again, I have a ton of stories. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you have to do an RFP, again, I don't, government, I know sometimes it's legally required, but outside of it legally being required, don't do an RFP is if no other message is taken away from this talk, do not do an RFP. Now, if you're going to do one though, I would say, let's keep it short and sweet. And also, let's be honest up front. Like, if you're going into it and everyone else is column fodder, I wouldn't say just tell people that, but that's another reason to keep it short. Is you probably already know who the winner is, but leave enough margin to let someone come in and do the wow factor. But do not force, I've seen them, no joke, over 1,000 questions, questions. And that one in particular, the one that was over 1,000, I treated it more like, I didn't think we were going to win. And one of the reasons, red flag number one is if you can see language in that RFP that is verbatim from another vendor, because certain things are universal. Like if I say an agent, everybody knows what an agent is, right? But if I say a cups server, that's actually the name of a product. And if you ask something about, like, tell me about your cusp server, that goes to show that they don't really know what they're talking about, because they just now named a product, right? That'd be like saying, like, tell me about your Honda CRV. It's like, wait a minute, I thought we were doing SUVs and you just said Honda CR-V, that's a little different there. That's a specific product that we don't make our own, right? And that to me is red flag. And I've also seen them where I start reading through and I'm like, wait a minute. And then I go to something like, let's say, a vendor's website. And I'm like, wait a minute. And then it's like, their website is like 5 reasons to go with us. Strategic AI, It's the same language that has been taken off their marketing and inserted into the RFP.
Yep.
Tell us how you did it. And then so then you could be like, this vendor has won this RFP. Because A, they're using the names for their own products, not generic terms like a SIP proxy server. They're saying a cusp server, right? B, they're using language that they have taken from that vendor's marketing, right? I mean, can you imagine how difficult that is? Because that vendor's already created a marketing campaign around their products, so they're tailored together. And now you're somehow trying to circumvent that with your product, which doesn't quite fit into this square peg round hole. And that's, again, if there was a top 5 reasons RFPs are ridiculous, is I keep pulling from my industry, but a common one is how much I want to know how much your system costs as part of this RFP process. So I'm going to list out 5 things that I want pricing on. I want to know how much it is per agent. Well, guess what? If Amazon is responding to your RFP, they don't charge per agent. They charge every time you call a Lambda or every time you pull this other function. And so they have no idea. Like, you could have 1,000 agents. It's free. Never call a Lambda, And then when Amazon tries to fire back and say, look, the only way we can quote this is if we know about these functions you're going to do. And then they go, well, we don't know about those functions. And they say, well, we want to compete for your business, but your RFP is kind of a little hold in our hands here because we don't do it that way. And then it's like the RFP people are like they just don't even know how to respond because in their mind everyone does it that way. And it's like, no, they don't all do it that way. And I mean, over and over, you just keep seeing where like these vendors are just like, well, we want to respond to this RFP, but we're not sure what to put in here because we don't have the data we need. And then you have this ridiculous round of back and forth because during RFP process, they will allow for questions. And then a lot of times they'll be transparent and say, okay, we won't say who asked it, but so-and-so asked this question and here's our response. Mm-hmm. So-and-so asked this question and here's our response. And to me, that if there's gates at which you should drop off as a vendor, that is definitely one of them. Is the first time you see answers, especially if they're ambiguous. I've literally seen where they've written back, like they say, look, I don't do this. Do you know this? Or can you tell me this? And then they just say, nope, just do whatever you can. I've seen that written in a response. And it's like, there is no just do whatever you can. There is no, there is,
not
you
in
will
technology,
either give us
there's
what
not.
we need. Yeah, you will either give us what we need and we will give you a quote, or you won't, and there is nothing else. But unfortunately, I've seen tons of companies just plow forward, do whatever, respond to whatever. And again, like luckily, some firms I've been with recently are like, if we weren't involved in that business ahead of time, if we weren't talking to them ahead of time, we are not going to do business with them at all. We're not going to, basically have anything to do with.
Steve is having technical difficulties right now. Who's talking to you right now?
Stupid,
like what's this?
Stupid reminder. Yeah. And I told it to do not disturb. So before you get mad at me, I said do not disturb before we started this.
Well, I'm going to get mad at you. I'm allowed to get mad at Steve, am I not? Like we've been friends for too long for me to be. No, I'm not going to get mad at you. But I think you're right. when it comes to these RFPs, they're overblown how important they've been made, and unfortunately it's brazenly obvious that you've already made your choice. Like in some of these, like don't do that. Like I know that every company I've ever worked for has a RFP pre-built for a prospect that needs to run an RFP. They're like, here's the questions you should ask, here's the answers you desire, right? And a lot of times they overtly say things like product names where you're like, oh, well, that just eliminates us because we don't sell that product, right? Like it's almost don't be that guy.
Yeah, that's not a thing,
right? That does that. Don't. I do think there's something to be said for having a coach walk you through an RFP process so it's not terrible, because I think let me put this nicely, most people suck at it. And they're not even asking the right questions. They're not asking the questions behind the questions.
Yeah, and they're dated. That's another huge one. Is like if you let's say everything's moved to the cloud now, most things, right? And you start asking questions like right off the bat, how much rack space do I need for your environment? And you're like, oh, it's in the cloud. How many memory chips do I need to buy in advance? And then you're just like NA, the whole thing. And you're like, what is going on here? And the hilarious thing is I've seen ones that are like, we're looking to buy an enterprise cloud solution. And then every question is premise related. How many boxes is it going to come in? And you're like, what is happening right now? Because they basically bought an RFP. They bought an RFP that was 10 years old. And then they were like, well, we want a cloud solution, but we bought this RFP. We're just going to use it, even though none of them apply. And honestly, I think, again, advice back to running an RFP, at least if you can tell your RFP is way off track, like just by the responses you're getting, questions you're getting, at least then, have a chance for those vendors to talk to you. Because, again, that's where it gets really complicated, where you're like, look, I'm not allowed. RFP process, you can't talk to me, we can't meet, we can't do anything. I would say just have a general meeting, even if you're like, look, you can't talk to me individually because of the rule, a general meeting. I've actually seen customers do this. They bring us in, and then people start saying, look, this needs to be part of your RFP. You cannot leave it off. This whole section is going to differentiate the entire field. And you're not even asking questions about it. It's like you don't even know it exists. And that's ridiculous. Like, there's no way you can make this decision and not ask these questions, right? That's another huge one I've seen. And these people they're just so, losing their minds because they've got this process and they're going to run this process. And the moment you tell them it's not going to work, all the vendors are telling them it's not going to work. And then they're just like stuck in this procurement paralysis, like, well, this is how I run the RFP, and then you're just like, well, no one's gonna respond because it doesn't make any sense, and then they're just like, oh my god, like I don't breathing through the paper bag, right? It's like, give me a break. Like you can't do this. You can't go into an RFP like you know what you're talking about when you clearly don't, and then just tell people to figure it out in your responses. Like that is the worst way to do procurement.
I think procurement works for facility supplies. Like, I need to buy toilet paper and mops and chemicals. Okay, like that, I get it. What's the difference between your 2-ply toilet paper and my 2-ply toilet paper, right? Well, one of them is probably closer to 1-ply than the other. But when you're talking about technology and actually how to deliver it, it's so different. When you're actually delivering your solution, your cloud solution versus their cloud solution, right? And so I would argue that maybe keep the RFP process specific to these are the things that we need, right? Like, how would you support us in those areas, right? Like, don't make it like, all these nitty gritty things when you're not prepared to receive the answers or the questions that come along with that. That's why I argue maybe these things should be, 5 to 10 pages long, right? Like, we're exploring this. Tell us how you would solve our biggest problems. And then you actually get to the collaborative conversation.
Or just, tell me about your value, how you differentiate yourself in the market. Like, leave that open, right? I think that's a huge part of it. And then, like you said, is anybody reading these responses? Is anybody caring? I also think it's ridiculous if you have your 1,000-question RFP and you've hired a consultant. And I feel like that guy, it's 1,000 questions long because he's trying to prove his worth, right? He's like, oh, I'm going to come up with questions you never even heard of, right? And at the end of the day, over half this, not only do you not care about, but you're never going to do it. Like, it's not even on your roadmap, right? And then the problem is that you have this system you've built where, like, well, Section 8, you didn't have a response. So we're going to, we total up points. I've seen it where it's like, this question, you got a 1, 2, or a 3. 1 was like you had something, but it wasn't that great. 2 is you did it, but whatever, and then 3 was perfect. And then they just added the points, and that's who got down selected. And then at the end of the day, you're like, well, did you want Section 8? Not really. Were you ever going to do Section 8? No. Like, who told you to do Section 8? Well, the consultant. Okay, so we got eliminated for a section you're not going to do. you have no interest in doing, well, whatever. And then, like a lot of times you see vendors a roadmap, everything's roadmap if they can't do it. But still, like, again, you have to build it around your business. Like, what is most important to you? This section. Okay, that's fine. This section gets a ton of points. And if you somehow in a crazy world want to be like, all right, they're going to get extra points if they do things we're even thinking about, maybe, but you can't make it, that's not balanced, right? To have all of these weighted one, we've seen that where they do that. And also, it's very hard to assign value because some places are like, look, if you have to outsource it, that's a bad thing. So we're going to mark down. Even if you're like, look, we only outsource one section, but we outsource to the number one name in that section. And everything else we do in-house. So together, we're giving you best in breed. Now, granted, it is 2 solutions. But let's be honest. Almost everyone else you talk to is at a minimum going to be 2 solutions, right? And then second, okay, let's say some guy is not. Would you rather have someone that barely can do this other section? Like they've done just enough to check the box. That's a phrase we use. They've just enough to say they have a product. But the moment you ask them questions about it, it's no, 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 no. Which one would you rather have? But that's the problem. The RFP robs you of that, right? Because you selected them because they checked more boxes. But the moment they go and show you the thing, it's like, well, can it turn left? No. Does it have a horn? No. Is there a radio? No. Can I move the seats? No. It's like they've sold you a box with wheels, right? Versus someone else had the Bentley, but you're like, well, you didn't do everything else. It's like, okay. You've got me, but which one would you rather drive, right? Like, that's where it's just you're losing your mind. And, you might have had reasons because you got burned by someone that had to partner in the past. But you still have to look at the big picture. Like, what are you giving up to get this crazy thing you want, right? And that's where, again, it is so sad because, let's be honest, most people, if it's a big procurement exercise, they don't really know all aspects. Yeah. They don't know, I'll keep going back to the industry I know, where an aspect of it could be the workforce management. They know what workforce management is, but if you told them, how would you pick workforce management vendor A over B? How would you do that? Who would win? Like if you had to compare them. They don't even have anything they could tell you. They know what it is. It helps people with scheduling. Okay. Well, what would be a good workforce management versus a bad? They have no clue. Yeah. No clue. And the problem is that their questions reflect it. Do you have workforce management? Yes, I have it. Like, it'll schedule something, right? Well, does it work with all channels? No. Does it allow shift bidding? No. Does it take into account employee salaries? No. Is it cloud-based? Nope. Is it in color? I mean, you just go down the list. It does none of them. But do they have it? Yes. Are they going to check it? Yes. Are you going to eliminate someone else thinking all workforce management systems are the same and you check that box so you're good to go? Yes, because you don't know any better. That is another huge mistake in procurement, is assuming that these things are so simple and that everybody's basically the same, and therefore I'm going to judge everyone based on cost, or I'm going to judge everyone based on a vendor I did business with before, or had a really good golf game, I guess, right? Or I know from so-and-so. I'm not saying networking means nothing, but if that's the only reason you're making a decision, like you're a discredit to that procurement process. You are a total discredit.
That makes me think, and I've thought this for a long time, that one of the worst things you could possibly do is think you have it all figured out and that your RFP is going to be a catch-all for solving your problem. Because what if the way you're solving your problems today, right, is the wrong way? And you have to be willing to admit that I'm not doing things as efficiently as I want. That's why I am changing solutions, right? Like I'm changing solutions because I need a better solution. So don't take your mindset that got you into the solution that you're in and apply that to the next solution or, vendor or program that is meant to solve the biggest problems that you have because your current way of doing it is broken, right? Or it's not efficient, or it's not innovative, right? Whatever it is. And so I think you really, truly need to lean on whoever it is that you're interacting with to teach you how to do it properly, because they have more industry expertise a lot of times than you do, either sitting in the seat of procurement or procuring a solution. Even as a leader who's maybe got a lot of experience, that takes nothing away from you. Just be humble about it, that you don't know everything. You don't need to know everything. You actually need a true partner that can walk you through and say, hey, look, this is your portion of what needs to happen on this, and this is what it's going to execute. So you know enough to be dangerous. You know enough to be able to call, bull when somebody is telling you something. But you don't need to be the expert. You have a partner for that, right? It frees you up, in my opinion, to be more focused on the things that you are good at, right? Which is probably not purchasing software or other things, right? Does that make sense? And so leave some room in there, because the people that I have seen fill out those stupid RFPs in the procurement process are usually the scum of the earth. They're the worst of the worst. They're willing to answer your 1,000 questions with detail because they have nothing else to do. My opinion.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely normally doesn't go to the highest paid person. And then I think, again, like, just setting unrealistic timelines. I mean, that's another huge one I've seen, where they'll have a 1,000-question RFP and they'll be like, it's due next week. And you're like, right?
Yeah, right.
No. I think, and then you see it keep getting extended. Oh, we've decided to allow the vendors to have another week out of the kindness of our heart. Like, no. Like, you basically figured out that no one was responding to your behemoth in a week, and you're praying that you get some responses next week. Otherwise, they're going to start asking questions around, like, what are you doing? like this RFP is insanity. And I think you've got to take it from the standpoint of, okay, I was forced to do an RFP. All right, what are some takeaways? And then I like it, honestly, where I've seen where they narrow it down, because certain ones just never responded or didn't seem interested. Narrow it down to 3, but then you meet with them. You meet with all 3. Because, again, what is causing a ton of this problem? Because it's bad communication, right? If you write bad questions, I can't write good answers to bad questions. I can't do it because they don't make sense. They're like ships passing in the night. If we sit down and talk and be like, look, like, I understand, this, your RFP, I'm kind of figuring out where you're at, but realistically, you didn't ask about these things, which are very important. You did ask about this, but you asked about it in a way I can't answer, because that's not how it works anymore. It used to work that way, but it doesn't work that way anymore. And then you just start peeling it back. Like, you don't immediately tell them their baby's ugly, but you basically say, look, these are, this is how there are a bunch of different ways.
You don't immediately tell them their baby's ugly.
Yeah.
It's
you
ugly,
get around to it.
But
you're like,
we're
your
gonna take it easy on you, right? That's how we get to know each other.
Yeah. Your baby, he's got a good personality. He's got a good personality, right? Like, so you work into it. It. It's got a lot of interesting things going on.
Well, look, I think another big part of this is, how do you negotiate in the vendor selection process? Let's say it's RFP, let's say it's not. Like, I just think that there's a lot of common mistakes that happen in this arena, right? And I see a lot of people, what's the old saying? They take the baby out with the bathwater, like, they just dump them out. And I think, in essence, basically what that means is that they will disqualify you or qualify you based on their limited ideas and things like that, and then they'll try to negotiate your solution, which is very unique, down to the lowest cost that they can possibly do. Which I don't have a problem with negotiating. I think it's important that you do that. But I also think that if you're looking at product A, B, and C, and they've all got different ways that they're going to approach the problem, well, you should probably value those differently, I would think. And so you can't just go to the lowest common denominator and say, well, this is the best one because of price, right? I also think if you're going to have a long-term successful relationship, you have to be able to attribute some value to it. I have a friend who has the ROI shop. He was actually second episode here on What the Tech, and he's just got a beautiful process of going through that, because a lot of times I realize you're trying to get the lowest price because you don't want to go to your internal leadership and say, well, this is how much this problem is and this is how much it costs, right? That's without a lot of data and insights and frankly time put into that to like create an ROI. You're gonna fail probably, and you don't want to look bad in front of your other leaders within the organization that are going to help you make this decision. And a lot of times they're also operating from a lack of information, right? And so I want to get your perspective on it, Steve. I have a lot of thoughts around how to negotiate with vendors that you get a win-win scenario, because you can't have a win-lose and have a successful partnership long-term, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I feel like they always say the best deals are the ones where nobody walks away happy because everyone had to concede something on some level, right? And vendors can hide cost, and they can hide. They can have a lot of tricks to come in the lowest, right? I mean, one of the obvious ones in my business, just again, it shocks me how many people don't figure this one out, is if I had to cut corners and come in as the lowest bidder, where am I going to do it? Probably actually not in my product, because I want my product to look sexy. I want you to fall in love with it. Everybody likes it. It shows great, right? Guess what never gets demoed? A tour of the support center, right? Like, no one's like, hey, fly into whatever godforsaken country where these people are on folding chairs, working, I guess, 24-hour shifts that barely speak English, that answer the phone apparently when you have a problem. Let's tour this place, shall we? No, right? Like, they hide that, and they hide the fact that, okay, we'll put down SLAs and things like that, but then when we don't achieve them or whatever, you're still on the hook for the contract, right? I mean, we might have to pay a penalty, but what are you going to do, right? So that's a great way to be like, I'm going to come in super cheap because I'm not going to pay anything for the people that run the support center. I'm going to find the cheapest support center. I'm going to use my procurement to literally search the globe for the lowest man rate humanly possible. And that's what I'm going to do for my support. And guess what? On the RFP, you're going to be like, do you have 24/7 support? Yep. And someone else, do you have 24/7 support? Yep. And one of them is twice the price. And you're like, I'm going with the cheap one. Well, guess what? Guess how they pulled that magic off? It's no secret, right? That they've found every way to cut corners on this one area. And if you don't think support's important, wait until something goes down, right? And then you'll find out how important it is to your business, right? And that's, unfortunately, I've never seen where they find out the support is horrible, and then the CEO runs over to the procurement office and says, hey, like, what have you guys done to us, right? You bought this thing, and its support is terrible. We're locked into a 5-year contract. They're like, I'm sorry. Like, hang up the phone, right? Don't open the door, because they never looked into it. They didn't look at the whole scope, and that's, again, why just looking at price is ridiculous. Like, you have to look at the big picture. You have to understand, like, where these, ROIs are coming from. And again, that one I wouldn't even call an ROI. You just have to understand the full scope of what you're buying and how it's going to work. And I think when you're negotiating, I think it's great to say, look, I want references, because guess what? The references might tell you they got trash support, right? And references is a tricky thing too. I mean, we could spend a whole podcast on that one, but I feel like
let me tell you one situation I had with it. So we were in a big deal, and this is on our team's fault. It was our team's fault, but we were in a big deal. This was going to make our year, right? And we didn't do this. We should have, but we were waiting for 3 references. We got 2 very quickly for basically companies that looked like this company. It was the same size, same industry, all these other things. And, I had 2 that I could offer really quick. And these are people that I'd worked with for a long time, right? And knew very well. And I think you always need to ask those references, right? Just, hey, would you mind being a reference, right? Well, we got this 3rd one in. It was like 7 or 8 days after we needed it, right? And we were waiting for it. And what happened is the person who gave it to us said, oh, well, I've got this really great one. Well, we just assumed this person was accurate when they said this really great one. Mm-hmm. Well, we ended up losing that deal because that person, we didn't call them. We didn't call them to ask to see like what their experience was. And they were like, yeah, we hate them and we're leaving. Right? And I was like, what? So we find that out from our partner who had introduced us, and I just about lost it, right? Because like that could have been, it'd have been better that they had the 2 and not the 3rd than to give them the 3rd that just burned us, right? Just burned us, right? Because obviously I wanted to give a good picture of who we are and what we were doing. And my clients did that, but I didn't have any control over this other department and what they were doing and how that was being delivered. Right. And so we took what we could get because we were scrambling to try to deliver this, 3 check the box sort of thing. And I don't think that they did us justice because they had a different experience than the other two, but they ended up making that decision. That's on me and my team for not rooting that out. But those are the sorts of things that you may get, if you ask for specific things in that RFP around references, right? I don't.
And if you get too picky,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's another big one. They have to be in our industry. They have to be the same size. They have to, you're just really putting the companies over a barrel. And you're also shafting these companies that they have a lot to bring to the table, but they're newer companies, right? Like maybe they're not, less than 6 months old, but maybe they're 4 years old, but they don't have 15 banking references. That's no discredit to them. I mean, they're building a portfolio, but they don't quite fit into that aspect, right? Like let them provide what they have. It's not perfect, but at least you can talk and see how enthusiastic they are. But I mean, again, just on references, stop asking for references early. That is just like everyone in sales hates that, because guess what? Your best references, you don't want to burn them out. And if you're just kicking the tires, let's say they have 100 companies kicking the tires every year. That's 100 calls to that, A1 reference, right? And guess what? 100 of them were just kicking the tire. They just wanted to, kind of see what the market's at, but they're not making any decisions. So now you've just burned that reference 100 times over for companies that are just window shopping, right? And it's very difficult because most companies won't just admit to you they're window shopping. They'll be like, oh no, we're serious. And then they'll just burn your references, do nothing. And then it's like, and then companies wonder why, like when they ask for a reference after the first meeting, you're like, well, how serious are you? Like, we haven't even provided you a quote and you want to, oh yeah, we don't even get to quotes till we get references. And then you're like, well, we don't give references unless you guys are like ready to pull the trigger, because we don't burn out our references. And then they get all, like confrontational.
Yeah, no, you just nailed it. And I think on both sides, don't ask for them too early. If you're not serious. But secondly, if you're on the other side of that, make sure that you say, hey, look, I want to introduce you to some of my clients. But when you become a client of mine, just understand you're going to be happy, and I'm going to have clients, new prospects that want to talk to you. And the last thing I want to do is to fill up your time with people who are just kicking the tires, just kind of interested, right? And so as long as you understand that, I am happy to make that introduction when you're ready, right? Like this is the final step. I just need references to make sure that everything you said like lines up with what we're trying to achieve, and that your clients are actually experiencing that. Don't ask for it before that. I love that perspective, Steve. I mean, and it's the right one, right? For everybody. Everybody wins there, right? I think.
Yeah. Because again, I think, unfortunately, it gets more difficult to find the exact reference you want. Like in terms of, I want them to fit my vertical, but I also want them to have the thing I'm buying from you. Well, what if the thing I'm selling you is new? And it just came out last year. We don't have a ton with the new thing, but we got stuff with the, well, no, it has to be on the new thing. Again, that makes it very difficult because you might only have 2 or 3 people on the new thing, and only one of them has agreed to be a reference, and now they're getting phone calls every freaking week because that's what they want. They want that one thing, and then you're just like stuck. You're just like, well, I can't keep abusing this guy, but that's exactly what they're demanding. And it's like, it's almost like the procurement people are like, well, that's their problem. Like they don't look at the big picture. They're like, well, I want the reference. I mean, it might burn that guy out, but I need it. Like, it's just like, just making the process miserable for everyone.
Well, I think we covered a lot in this, but we're here at about an hour at this point. And so, look, if you're listening right now and you would like some more perspective around procurement, I think we could go for probably another hour about things that we have grievances about around the process. And not only that, areas where you can negotiate effectively, not only get what you want, but also get the best value. Stop asking stupid questions, things like that. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that, make sure you comment down below. I want to thank you again, Steve, for obviously coming on here and giving your unique perspective. And for those of you that have been listening to the show, either for maybe this is the first time or for a very long time, I want to tell you I appreciate you. I thank you for coming back each and every week. We're trying to produce content here that is helpful for those of us that are in the world of business, especially around technology and looking to improve our skills, leverage those experiences to improve our careers and our businesses. And so keep coming back, and we'll see you next week. Take care.